Marco Polo, His Travels and Adventures, Chapter 9, Part 1. Marco Polo's Travels in Cathay. After leaving Pianfu, Marco traveled steadily westward, always seeing something new and curious that deeply impressed itself on his memory. He was surprised at the great size of many of the rivers he crossed, some of which far exceeded in width any he had ever seen in Europe, and which could not be spanned by bridges. When he came to such a stream, he and his train were transported to the further bank on large rafts and barges. He was especially struck, too, by the size, numbers, and splendid plumage of the birds which people the Tartar forests, and the plenteous and luscious fruit that grew in the river valleys. Sometimes his road led by zigzags to the summit of lofty mountains, whence he had fine views of all the country round, and where were spacious inns and royal houses wherein he rested. One bridge that he crossed was constructed wholly of marble, and upon it were long ranges of shops, where a lively trade was going on. This much reminded him of the Rialto at home in Venice. At last, after traveling many weeks, he reached the important province of Tibet. As he crossed the borders of this country, he found himself constantly in danger from the bold and barbarous brigands that found safe retreats in its mountain fastnesses. More than once, Marco and his companions had to fight these fierce robbers for their lives. As an envoy of the Khan, Marco would have been a rich prize, and the treasure he carried with him, to be given as presents to the vassal kings of the Khan, would have been no despicable booty. But every time that he encountered the Tibet robbers, he repulsed them, and got off with a few slight wounds which soon healed. Marco was very much struck with the wealth and rich productions as well as the picturesque aspect of Tibet. He found gold very plenty, so plenty that many of the commonest people wore golden ornaments on their arms and around their necks. Cinnamon was one of the most valuable resources of the country, and the women displayed a great deal of coral on their persons. Tibet was full of wizards and astrologers, but Marco thought them, unlike those of the Kambalu, wicked men who served rather the devil than mankind. He saw many very large dogs in the country, which seemed to him as big as donkeys, and which were excellent hunters, and he was amazed at the height to which the canes grew in the jungles. These canes were used by caravans who passed through the jungles at night to make fires with, and thus to keep off the lions, tigers, and bears that prowled in the dark, dismal swamps. There was a long tract of country in Tibet which was uninhabited, and Marco and his companions were obliged to take enough food with them to last until they had crossed this tract. Every night they camped in the dreary solitude, making great roaring fires of the gigantic canes. On reaching the limit of this waste, Marco found a country that was inhabited, indeed, but by a degraded and wicked people who robbed everyone who came into their neighborhood without scruple, and lived on the fruits and on what game they could procure in the woods. They used lumps of salt as money and clad themselves in the skins of wild beasts and in the coarse clothes. Marco saw cinnamon, cloves, and ginger growing in this region, and examined them with eager curiosity. On crossing the wide river which formed the frontier of Tibet, Marco reached a kingdom ruled over by one of the great Khan's sons. Here again he saw plenty and prosperity, noble castles, and thriving cities. He paid a visit to the king, the Khan's son, from whom he received a very gracious welcome, and who entertained him with much honor in his palace. Marco was glad to once more find himself in a land which appeared thrifty and civilized. The people seemed to him more like those of the Kambalu than any he had seen, and he narrowly observed their various customs and industries. He saw a great deal of grain and rice growing, and noticed that here the money was made of a kind of porcelain, taken from the sea. Vast quantities of salt were dug from pits near the principal city, and not far off there was a great lake, 100 miles long, from which an abundance of fish of many kinds were taken. The people ate their meat and fish raw in garlic sauce. While Marco was in this country, he enjoyed a strange sort of sport, that of snake hunting. It appeared that the region abounded in huge reptiles, some of them 20 or more feet long, with heads shaped like a loaf of bread and big mouths wide enough to swallow a man. These snakes lay, in the daytime, in underground caves where it was dark and slimy, crawling forth at night in search of prey, and to drink in the rivers and ponds. They thus made long tracks in the sand. Marco set out, late one afternoon, with a party of snake hunters, and soon came to a place where these tracks were visible. Some of the natives at once set to work, fixed a kind of trap across the tracks, and covered it all over with sand. Then they lay in wait till a snake should squirm out of his cavern and make his way toward the neighboring river. Presently one was seen, slipping rapidly along through the sand, straight towards the spot where the trap was concealed. In another moment the trap had caught his huge body. The snake's head rose high in the air, his fangs shot out, and a sharp hissing noise was heard. The natives rushed up and found that the teeth of the trap had nearly severed the reptile in two, and a few blows soon settled him. The party returned in triumph, and Marco was delighted to have seen so novel a sport. The huge snake's gallbladder was taken out, and on asking why this was done, Marco learned that it was an infallible remedy for the bite of a mad dog. The snake's body was then cut up and sold for food, the people regarding it as a very delicate and palatable dish. Marco saw in this land many magnificent horses, in which the people took great pride. The men were very skillful horsemen, and always went to the hunt or to battle astride of their steeds. Marco was very much pleased when, on parting from the king, the latter presented him with several of the finest of these horses. The next province which Marco reached seemed to him a very curious place. So strange were the manners and customs of its people. He perceived that the first man and woman whom he met on the road had their teeth completely covered with plates of gold, and he soon found that this was the general custom. The money of this people consisted both of porcelain, gold, and silver. They had no idols or temples, but each family worshipped its chief as a god, nor did they have any doctors. But when any one was ill, they sent for a magician who performed incantations over the invalid and danced about and howled in the most dismal manner.